right, good morning everyone, or good afternoon depending on your location, and welcome to today's webinar, The 4 Habits of Highly Forgettable People, Why Your Business Presentations Don't Bring in the Business. My name is Steve Jones, Vice President of Marketing here at Corporate Visions, and I'll be moderating today's event. Before we get started though, I do want to go over a few housekeeping items so we can make today's event as interactive as possible for everyone in attendance. You've joined the presentation using your computer speakers by default. If you'd prefer to join by phone, just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You'll also have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane on the control panel. Feel free to go ahead and send those questions in at any time during the event, and we'll collect those and answer them throughout today's webinar. Also, as a reminder, following the event, we'll be sending all attendees a recording of the webinar along with the actual slides within the next 24 hours or so. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. First, our very special guest, who is sure to become a regular on our webinars, Carmen Simon, the new Chief Science Officer here at Corporate Visions and the founder of Memzy, a leader in neuroscience-backed presentations and content. And Tim Riesterer, Chief Strategy Officer at Corporate Visions, co-author of the 3 Value Conversations, and also co-author of the upcoming book, The Expansion Sale. Tim, I think you're kicking it off for us today, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Right, thanks, Steve. I'm only going to take a minute here to get Carmen on board because that's what everybody's here for. But you know, it's interesting. I read recently a business article that said that the worst thing that can happen to us is to become irrelevant, and that in business you can recover from bankruptcy much more easily than you can recover from irrelevancy. And so being invisible or inconsequential or forgettable are very bad things to happen in business. And the main vehicle that many of you in business engage in terms of communicating is presentations and the story you tell and the way you tell that story has everything to do with your content. So I'm excited to bring Dr. Carmen Simon into the circle of trust here. Most of you are here on this webcast because you are part of the Corporate Visions, if you will, information family. You've raised your hand and attended other webcasts or checked out our other science-backed content. And this is no different. What's exciting about this is there is actually a science-backed way for you to communicate in PowerPoint in a way that drives more memory and makes you more memorable. So I'm going to be turning it over to Carmen now and asking her to tell us about the research that she's done and the impact that she's had in the area of more unforgettable presentations.
I am excited to be on this call, especially as you're talking about the danger of being irrelevant. I would equate that with the danger of being forgettable then. And it's exciting to address this notion of content and memorable content from the angle of how the brain works, because everybody in your audience has a brain. And you might be smiling as I'm making that statement because sometimes you don't see the evidence of a brain, but it's true. Everybody has one, so it's important to understand how it works. I'd love for all of you to use the answers function here in GoToWebinar and share with us, why do you think human beings have a brain? I'm sure that as you're pondering that question, perhaps some of you are thinking that we have a brain so that we can evolve in some way. Scott is saying here, we have a brain, perhaps you're thinking so we can communicate. We have a brain so we can support our, of course, nervous system and regulate our behavior. Overall, it is important to have a brain so we can survive. And all of you are correct in the answers that you're providing, and thank you for communicating with us this way. There will be a lot of interaction that will happen throughout the session through our questions panel. And all of your answers are correct. At the very basis of it all, what ties all of your answers here in the answers box together is the fact that we have a brain so we can move. physically move. And what we know from neuroscience is that the brain does not make any move unless there is memory involved. And from this angle, that means that if you want to convince someone to move in your favor, which I'm sure is one of the main reasons why you are on a webinar like this, that means that you have to find a way to create memories on that person's brain. To be memorable means to be persuasive in the sense of convincing others to move in your direction. So for the rest of the call, I would love to make memory our mission for all of us, regardless of your job, whether you are in the business of selling things, promoting things, marketing other materials, training people, perhaps you're in an operations function. Regardless of your role, at some point, you want to convince someone to move in your direction. To do so, you must learn how to create memories on that person's mind. We look at memorable communication from the angle of how the brain works, particularly from the angle of using EEG technology to understand what happens to the brain in reaction to stimulation. What we know is that when we place the EEG caps, EEG stands for electroencephalogram, that means that we're using these electrodes on people's scalps to record the brain waves that get generated, and those brain waves differ in terms of amplitude and frequency. As you can see here on my screen, when you're sleeping, you're experiencing a delta wave, which has a high amplitude and a lower frequency. And when you're watching perhaps a show like a Game of Thrones, your brain might be experiencing a gamma wave, because now you're definitely alert and awake and energetic. So it's intriguing to us as we undergo a lot of EEG studies to detect delta as people are exposed to business communication, business presentations in particular. So that it's possible to physically put somebody to sleep, and we can monitor that and see it on a scanner. As we record the brain waves in real time, we then process them through various statistical analysis programs. In this study that we were doing a few weeks ago, luckily there was no delta for this one client. And we looked to see where in the brain specific brain waves occur, to what intensity, and also with what synchronicity, because sometimes you might be experiencing something on one part of the brain with one intensity, and on another part of the brain with another intensity in the same frontal lobe, for instance, and that could be indicative of several cognitive processes. As we perform our studies, from which we generate insights that we then use in communication materials, sometimes we use EEG caps and other hardware that's a bit more intense. As you can see here in the middle, we have quite a few electrodes there. We also use an ECG cable, that's an electrocardiogram, to capture a heart signal. It's exactly the same signal that you would have if you go to the hospital and you have an EKG done. Sometimes our devices are a little bit more benign. We always enjoy using the eye tracking in relation to the EEG, just because we're curious to know where is it that people are looking and for how long. And overall, what we detect is that business people are overall more forgettable than they are memorable. Well, not you, because you're attending a webinar like this. You're already committed to doing something differently about your communication materials. Other people that you know, they are more forgettable than they are memorable. What to do? So the purpose of today's session, as we make memory our mission, is to share 4 habits of highly forgettable people. And if we understand these habits and we aspire at earning a spot in somebody else's brain, let's see how we can do not necessarily only the opposite of what these people are doing, but also something extra so that we can indeed create memorable content. Here's habit number 1 from the studies that we conduct and from all the presentations that we redo for clients. We recognize that one of the habits of highly forgettable people is that they're not managing to attract enough attention. Attention is mandatory when it comes to memory because attention paves the way to memory. Obviously, it is possible for the brain to remember something that it doesn't pay attention to consciously, but none of you here on the call are after some subliminal ways of creating communication. It's way more satisfying when you do something consciously and somebody else's brain also pays attention consciously because of your efforts. What we notice when it comes to attention is that just because you enable somebody to look somewhere, it does not mean that they see perhaps what you want them to see. So from a scientific perspective, we can ask the question, well, if we want the brain to pay attention better, then how is it that the brain pays attention to begin with? Well, to answer that question, we can dig a little bit more deeply and first ask another question, which is, where does the brain look? Because when you're looking at something, you can look outside in the external world, so you have an external focus, but you can also direct your attention inwards to your own thoughts, to your own feelings and processes that are happening on the inside. And also when it comes to attention, that attention process can be generated by you, the individual, or at some point, somebody is making you look. Somebody's forcing you to direct your focus somewhere. So now we have these quadrants. As scientists, we love quadrants because they enable us to measure something a bit more specifically. And notice how now we're giving you some practical techniques that you can apply in your own presentations, content materials, marketing materials, regardless of what it is that you're creating. Let's see where you're at, where these intersection of these quadrants are concerned, and what you can do differently. For instance, in the upper right corner, we know that you as a communicator can be in charge of forcing somebody to look in a specific spot. And how do you do that? You do that by manipulating physical properties of stimulation, such as color, size, shapes, brightness. Different things perhaps are louder or smaller or bigger or brighter. And we're taking these examples and these guidelines very seriously in our own business because we use these brain science insights to recreate our own customers' content. For instance, when we know that we can attract focus through physical properties of stimulation, we have more recently started using videos inside PowerPoint slides. These are slides from an example of a corporate pitch from a software company that's with us in the Bay Area. They're telling their prospects to reflect on their own business, asking them, how are they doing right now? Are they barely making it? Are they staying in there somehow? Are they surviving? Obviously, everybody wants to thrive in some way, but even thriving is not easy given some conditions that are happening these days and some trends that are occurring. I guarantee that many of you on this call could probably take this slide and make it your own. The point of these examples is to look at the physical properties of some of the stimulation here, things that are moving, things that are of a specific size versus something that's of a smaller size, things that are of a specific color versus things that are a bit more muted. All of these are purposefully created to draw somebody's attention to a specific spot. Does your communication do that? And when the answer is yes, you're doing it correctly. If the answer is no, then you know that now you have a practical guideline, and this is by far one of the easiest out of these 4 quadrants for you to use because you are in charge of what you're creating. So take advantage of that. Lower right corner, you're still in charge of drawing somebody else's focus, and you can control that, but you also have the option of drawing their focus inwards. And how do we do that when we recreate our client's content? We do that by simply asking questions. For instance, in this workshop, we are designing the slides for a workshop on prospecting. And obviously, everybody here on the call is familiar with the notion of prospecting. You know what that means. But notice how first we ask the question, and then we gave people the answer. So as you're thinking about your own content, are you immediately prescriptive about what you're offering? Or are you engaging just slightly? You don't have to insist on the question for too long. Just ask a question and then allow the brain to contribute with something first. We're doing the same in this screen here. We're asking salespeople where are they spending their time, allow them to reflect, guide the focus inwards, and then provide the answer. The moment that you ask the brain a question, it is mandated to answer. Do you think that's true? See, even right now, we don't hear your voices, and perhaps some of you may have answered verbally, and some of you may have answered silently, but you did answer because anytime you ask the brain a question, it is meant to answer and guide its focus inwards. Take advantage of that technique. Also, one of the easiest to use. This lower left quadrant might give you some moments for you to guide your own focus inward, because you might think, well, according to the intersection of these variables, the brain is directing its own attention and it's directing it inward. So you as a communicator perhaps don't have a role. But I would dare say that you do, because if your communication is strong enough and it is inviting people to reflect on something that is so important in their space that it's still on their minds days later after you approach them with some communication, then you can still make an impact there. And this is how we know for this to be so. For instance, we were doing a recent study where we are asking the question, what's more memorable? A sales pitch in a printed format, as you see this woman looking at a handout on her desk, or a sales pitch that was created in a PowerPoint format? Ooh, the intriguing PowerPoint format. By the way, which one do you think ended up being more memorable? The printed handout for a sales pitch or the PowerPoint slides? This handout had 4 pages. It had an intro page, and then as she opens it, you can see the problem on the left, you can see the solution on the right, and you can see an ending page when she would have turned it over. And as I'm reading through some of your answers here in the box, I see that quite a few of you are going for the printed. A few are going for the PowerPoint, and there are merits to each. And I like what Danielle is mentioning here. She says whatever you can take away. So perhaps if somebody gives you the PowerPoint slides afterwards, that's your takeaway. If you can take the handout away, then that's your takeaway. Perhaps somebody is really strong at presenting, in which case they might make you remember some things despite any takeaways, like physical takeaways. In this study it was an intriguing one because there are merits for both files. But with a printed handout, you have to be very careful, because what we noticed is that while the presenter was delivering something in the upper left corner, the brain is so curious naturally, and the eye gaze was going somewhere in the lower right corner. So you have to be cautious that indeed, if you're using something that's printed, you guide your user's eyes, because otherwise, left to their own devices, they will be all over the place, in which case the linearity of a PowerPoint deck, if it's well designed, can actually help you be better in control of what people remember and not leave it to chance. But the point that I'm making here, however, is for that lower left quadrant where I'm saying, can you make such a big point and an insightful point where you're in somebody's mind and they're reflecting on what you're saying in the absence of any external stimulus? I'm hoping that the answer is yes for all of you listening. As we were doing the heat maps for this handout, notice how people were focused mainly on the problem versus the solution. So already, if we're working with a client, we know that something needs to be done differently, because obviously we can insist on the problem, but ultimately we want people to remember the solution. But this brought us to a point of reflection, because one of the reasons why people will focus on the problem is because these guys, at the very least, managed to organize something that was fairly chaotic in a very nice way. And when you do that for your own audience's brains, you manage for them to reflect on what you're saying, even days later when you're no longer in the room. So as you're pondering your own content and your own techniques, regardless of your job function, can you think of ways in which you help somebody make sense of a chaotic field that they're in? Can you help their brains make sense of the complexity that very likely is surrounding them right now? Because you see, as communicators, we're so worried, sometimes unnecessarily so, by so much external stimulation. These days you hear statements like, oh, we are bombarded with information, which in a sense is true, but we need to be more humbled by how much internal buzz our brains have, which is why, by the way, we can debunk the myth that we use way more than 10% of our brains, because our brains are active even when we're sleeping. And one of the reasons they're active is because they have to make sense of all these chaotic things that we experience through the day. So help your audiences make sense of the complexity that surrounds them. And when you enable somebody to put order into their chaos, you can indeed manage to have an impact even in this lower left quadrant of how attention works. There is one more practical guideline that you'll enjoy as we're going around these quadrants. This is the visual search quadrant, and that reminds us that you can be in control of creating information in such a way that when the brain is directing its own attention outwards, it can find things easily. When you reflect on your own way of doing communication, regardless of your media, perhaps you're creating presentations, perhaps you're creating campaigns, you're sending out emails, you're creating videos. Throughout all this media, are you enabling somebody else's brain on its own accord to find what it's looking for easily? I'm hoping the answer is yes. We practice what we preach also when we redo our clients' presentations, for instance. In this case, we really wanted the eyes to be drawn to the quality versus the quantity of it all. And notice how the use of contrast and colors and shapes and even orientation of objects, we're guiding the eyes to where we want them to look. Even though we know people are looking on their own accord, nobody's truly forcing them. At some point, many of these techniques are going to work in combination because you are still using physical properties of simulation and orientation of objects, but also contrast, and you're making things easy to find. Because you see how the brain works when it's looking for things. Notice how in this box right here, if I were to ask you to find a green letter, do you see how easy I'm making it for your brain? A split second, and you already find it. In this next box, if I ask you to find a T, notice also how a split second and you find it. But in this third one, if I ask you to find a green T, do you notice how much harder I'm making it for your brain to find that? Obviously not impossible, but what happens in terms of comparison from the third example to the first two is that in the first two examples, your brain processes information in parallel, whereas in the third example, your brain now has to process information serially. So you're taking one chunk and you're thinking, is it here? No, it's not. Then you move on to the next chunk. Is it here? No, it's not. Then you move on. So now I'm enabling you to expend unnecessary extra cognitive energy in order to find something. We're noticing that this is a lot of what business people do out there. They may have pertinent information. There's nothing wrong with any of these four examples that I'm sharing here on the screen, but you're not making it easy for your audience's brains to find perhaps something that serves you and them well. So as we're going around these quadrants, you can see how now you have something that can be easily converted into practical techniques for you to apply. There's one more segment that I want to attach to this first habit of highly forgettable people. Before I do, I want to turn it over to Tim and Steve. Do you have any reactions based on what I'm sharing so far? You know the audience members, and you know some of their struggles. Any epiphanies or thoughts that are generated in reaction to this?
I think that what I've taken away from this is that there's more control that can be exerted over your presentations in terms of controlling what they're taking in and what they're retaining. And I think that people, maybe me included, we make some choices because we have some feelings or opinions about them, but there's really rigor and science behind those choices, and they may be different than how we feel, right? I mean, it's an interesting thing as we have opinions and feelings about what makes certain things happen, but in reality, the science tells us other things make things happen. And I think what's exciting about this is in 4 simple ways, you've showed us how to consciously think about how to accomplish attention as opposed to hoping we've accomplished attention. So I love the deliberate nature of it.
Yes, and I think the key word from what you just said is deliberate, because when you take charge of having some guidelines and some techniques in your repertoire, and now you become intentional about how you direct attention, then not only are you then able to draw that attention, but also it's so much more satisfying because now you know that it was through your efforts that something happened and you didn't leave it to chance. And where attention is concerned, we also know that the brain is going to give you some attention if the reward is worthwhile, because we will expand some extra cognitive energy in your favor if indeed the journey is worth the effort. And the reason for that is because whenever the reward is clear, there is this dopamine buzz that we're experiencing in our brains. I'm sure that every single person on our call, no exception, knows about this neurotransmitter. It's been one of the popular chemicals to study, so popular in fact that we're calling it the Kim Kardashian of neurotransmitters, which I don't think is fair to dopamine. But this is so widely studied, and rightfully so, because the more recent finding is that you don't need to have dopamine in your brain to like chocolate. You need to have dopamine in your brain to go get it. So there is a correlation between the presence of that neurotransmitter on your brain and you having enough drive to move towards a stimulus. So as you reflect on your own communication, always ask this question: am I clarifying the reward for what I'm offering? In this case, when we were doing a study on where the attention was going for a specific sales deck, notice how in this slide there were 4 circles, only one of them mentioned money. And since this was for sales reps, of course their attention would be driven towards the bigger reward. So ask yourself, is the reward clear? Knowing that your audience's brains are constantly evolving. What used to be rewarding yesterday might perhaps be today just a mundane norm. I'm often impressed with this show. I'm sure that every person here on this webinar has seen or heard of them. What you may not know is the creators of this show boast degrees in computer science and physics and math. They have PhDs from Yale and Harvard. And much of that wisdom that they have is sprinkled throughout many of these shows, just so that they can appeal not only to kids and adolescents, but even to the more sophisticated brain, the more sophisticated demands. I'll give you an example. At some point, Marge, everybody knows Marge, she's at a baseball game. And very briefly on the screen, we see this, on the Jumbotron screen, we see this multiple choice question. And a few of you might be math buffs on this call, and if you are, then you might recognize that these are no ordinary numbers. So while the average mortal might look at this thinking, oh, what a cutie thing to do, we recognize quickly that the first number is considered a perfect number. What's a perfect number? If you find all the numbers that this number is divisible by and you add them all together, you end up with the original number. There are about 100 perfect numbers in math. The second number is considered a narcissistic number. What's a narcissistic number? Well, if you count the number of digits that this number has, in this case it's 4 digits, and you raise each digit to that power, so the power of 4, and you add up with those numbers, you end up with the original number. And because the number could recreate itself from itself, it suggests that it's in love with itself. Therefore, it's a narcissistic number. And the third number matches a French mathematician. This is a 17th century French mathematician who used to study primes, and that is one of the Mersenne prime numbers. So imagine, this screen was there just for a few seconds, and they're able to appeal to even the more sophisticated brain looking for the most sophisticated rewards. And the guideline that I have for all of us is this: make sure that the reward is clear as you're creating communication for your audiences, and make sure that you're constantly keeping up with an ever-evolving brain that is constantly looking for bigger and bigger rewards. So that was the guideline related to attracting attention. Before I move on, I'll turn it back briefly over to Tim and Steve to see if they have any other reactions.
No, that's awesome. I'm keeping track of time since we have 3 more habits, so I'm going to turn it back to you, Carmen.
Yes, we keep on going. Since attracting attention, ultimately, it's not all that hard. Sustaining attention is another habit that I'd love for all of us to reflect on, because we can start with the premise that the brain does not have a short attention span. I always love debunking that myth. And one of the reasons why we can know that the modern brain does not have a short attention span is for all of you to be honest with us and to tell us, what is the longest amount of hours that you have binge watched on a show? If you use the answers box, I would love to know your honest answer, and I guarantee that a few of you are probably in the area of hours, not minutes. This is how we know that the brain can stay focused for a long amount of time. I'm seeing here 14 hours that Chris spent on something. I would love to know. I would love to know what that show would have been, because 14 hours is quite some time. You may hear studies that say human beings these days have the attention span of a goldfish. That could not be further from the truth. So we know that it is possible for the brain to stay engaged and stay paying attention, but how do we get there? Because ultimately we can attract attention to get people to stay with us for 14 hours, no less. That is quite a skill. We ask the same question when we redo people's presentations, and especially if they are done in slideware, very much like you're seeing here on the screen. We might ask the question, well, here we are, we have reached slide 12. How much do people still remember from slide 2? Are they still with us? Are they carrying things in their mind? That's called a working memory. So it's the working memory span that has to be of concern to us communicators. We can measure it very easily. For instance, picture yourself being in this fMRI machine. To test your working memory span, I would give you a string of letters like this, then I would take it away, and then I would ask you what that string was. And I'm pretty confident that when it came to those 4 letters, you can repeat them back fairly easily. Then I would increase the stimulus slightly, and I might give you a string like this. I would leave it up there for a second, and then I would take it away, and then I might ask you what that was. You can always use the answers box if you want to challenge yourself and tell us what you still remember. But when it comes to a string of fairly few letters, most people do fairly well. Now, when we start increasing the stimulus a bit more, so I might show you something like this, and then I take it away, and then I might ask you what that one was. And I see now we're increasing the string a bit, and it might be more challenging. And when we really tax you, then I'm curious to know if anybody on this call is going to recall that one. We might have some geniuses. By the way, and Humberto, thank you so much for your honest answer. I'm seeing some answers here in the box where there's no way you'd remember this, and that's very humbling to admit. By the way, there is the only correlation that we can find so far between memory and IQ is exactly with this component that I'm talking about here. It's with the working memory span. We tend to observe that smarter people tend to have a larger memory, a working memory span. But for all of us communicators, we have to ask the question, how can we fix this working memory problem? Because if you know how to fix it and how to expand the working memory span, then you can aim at long-term memory. It's a lot harder for somebody to develop long-term memory unless you go through the working memory filter. How do we solve this? Let's imagine for a moment that you're delivering a presentation to someone on cybersecurity. This is a very hot topic for people. You might see some slides that look like this. These may not necessarily be the most beautiful slides you've ever seen, but let's just say that in this presentation, I would tell you, be very cautious about how you set up your passwords. Don't make your passwords include your dog's name and your house number. Be very cautious as you're working at coffee shops because some creepy people like you see here might be lurking and watching over your shoulder, those kinds of things. So if we were to test your memory afterwards, we would notice that you would do better in a presentation like this because you're changing the stimulus fairly frequently. Notice how you're moving from some more intense slides to something that feels a little bit more emotional to something that is more text intensive. But even throughout all of these, what this presenter would have done well is to
Oops, Carmen, we lost your audio.
impress an audience so much with new information at the expense of linking a little bit of new information with elements that are already part of somebody's long-term memory. Be very respectful of elements that already exist in somebody's long-term memory because they worked very hard to put it there to begin with. So linking things to what exists already shows that respect. But also, you're making it a lot easier for somebody's brain to recall things later on because you have tied them to something that is already in that database. And the cognitive processing is not all that difficult. So the advice I have is to switch the stimulus often and also link something that you have as new to something that exists. And that's how you solve the working memory problem. Now, let's just mention that you have attracted attention, you have sustained attention for a while. What's habit number 3? Well, now you're including some pieces of communication in your presentations or your content. And the habit that we're noticing that leads people to forgettable content is to not balance abstract and concrete concepts. And this is what I mean. Notice as you're watching my screen, the moment that I'm taking something that is fairly abstract and I'm adding a concrete element around it, do you see how I'm making it easier for your brains to process that information? I'm doing it so here visually, but let's translate this into a realistic business example. Let's just take this concept of blockchain, for instance. If we hear blockchain one more time, everybody in business these days is talking about this concept. And for a while now, as we're helping our clients redo their PowerPoint presentations and their marketing decks and pitch decks, we've been asking, please help us understand what blockchain really means. And some people are giving us paragraphs of the type that you see here listed on the screen. Would you agree that if I gave you this paragraph and I asked you to remember this and tested your memory 48 hours from now, that you might not necessarily be as accurate as you could? And I imagine that many of your answers are going to be, yes, it'll be fairly difficult to remember with accuracy this kind of example. Perhaps it makes sense right now in the moment, but in 2 days from now, you might not be so sure. And Kathleen here says, I'm still confused by it. Maybe you could remember it. It doesn't mean that you fully understand what that means. And that's a good point that Heidi's making here in the chat box. So imagine that by contrast, I would tell you something like this. Let's picture blockchain as the box that a realtor uses on their house. You can use it to enter a space safely, and you can use it to exit a space safely. See, now I'm using words that are placing a mental picture in your mind because you can imagine the box, you can imagine the realtor, you can imagine a house, you can imagine a door, you can imagine entering and exiting a space. So I don't even have to show you a picture, although I very easily could, but I used language that enabled your brain to build a visual. This is such good news for all of us, by the way, because you can aspire at being memorable, and sometimes you might feel bad because you might not have access to amazing graphic artists that can put your thoughts into some unbelievable pictures. Just know that you don't always need that. Simply using concrete words that help somebody else's brain construct a mental image could be sufficient enough. So here I can actually show you an image, but even the words alone would have done the task. I'm such a great believer in this notion of balancing something that is abstract and something that is concrete, that I'd love for us to reflect on this a little bit more, and I'll have a very quick exercise for all of us in just 1 minute. I also want to show you that we are committed to applying these principles in our own work. We don't want to come across as hypocrites. Here we are telling you what to do. How is it that we do it? We have just recently released a service that's called Slide Club. You can check it out at slideclub.com. It is a subscription service where people receive either 5 or 10 slides per month that they intersperse in between existing slides that they have in their decks. And we take this principle of balancing abstract and concrete to heart. Like, for instance, if you're looking at this notion of something that is abstract, such as a story of competitive advantage, those words are very abstract, but now you're pairing them up with a concrete visual, you bring it to life. Notice how you're taking here in this slide a concept that is abstract, such as unconventional. You're pairing it up with something that's concrete. Now it's a lot easier for the brain to remember it and understand it, as Kathleen was prompting us to do a little earlier. In this message, a client of ours was challenging us to visualize this notion of the best just got better. And notice how when we pair something that is abstract with something that is concrete, now you really get it. And if we were to do a memory test 48 hours from now, you're going to have an increased chance of remembering this. I'm saying an increased chance versus complete certitude because what is science but the increased likelihood that something is going to happen? I'm really enjoying this slide that we created on transformation. Everybody talks about transformation these days. I like how creepy those eyes are over there in the middle. And when you're taking something that is abstract, such as transformation, you pair it up with something that's concrete. A lot easier for your brain to handle it. So as you're thinking of this notion of abstract and concrete, and before we move on to habit number 4, I would love for you to go to your cell phones and find a picture that has something that is very concrete. Like perhaps it's a landscape, perhaps it is a picture of food, perhaps it's a picture of shoes that you just bought, perhaps it's a place that you just visited, and title that picture with something that is abstract. Perhaps as you're looking at that food, you're with your family, and that's a picture of connection. Perhaps as you're reflecting on that landscape, that's a picture that signifies awe. Perhaps as you're thinking about traveling somewhere, perhaps that's a picture that can be titled freedom. I would love for you to send us a picture that has this combination of abstract and concrete. And I'm going to email all of you here, and you'll see this appear in the chat box. My email address, it is csimon@memzy.com. And please send me this picture. Take exactly 37 seconds. And I will switch from my slides to Outlook and share a few of your entries. Who knows, we might even have a prize for the most intriguing entry. But the purpose of the assignment is this. As you're looking at something concrete, can you pair it up with something abstract? And the reason that I'm prompting your own brains to reflect on this combination is this. Your audience's brains are going to need something that's concrete in order to build a mental picture, whether it comes from a physical picture or from words that you're using. You're helping somebody's brain build a visual. And by the way, we can debunk another myth. You may have heard that some people are visual learners, some people are auditory learners, some people have a kinesthetic learning style. Do not repeat that ever again. That's a myth. 60 to 70% of your body receptors, which is how you take in the world, are visual, which is indicating to us that you cannot go wrong with visuals. Now, you can give the brain an actual photo or use words that help people build a mental picture. But the point is, if you want to increase the chances of memory, help the brain build a mental picture. So the reason I'm advocating a balance, though, between abstract and concrete is as you're finding those concrete pictures, pair them with abstracts, because at some point the brain does need something abstract so that it can learn a lesson from one situation and apply it to another. And quite often those learnings, those meanings that you're prompting us to reflect on in the chat box earlier do come from those abstract concepts. So take a few more seconds. I'm very much looking forward to sharing some of your examples, concrete plus abstract, and we will see if we have something that's a special combination. We'll wait for a few more seconds, and I'll switch in just a moment. And then we'll finish up our session with habit number 4. As people are sending us some examples, Tim and Steve, do you have any other reactions or some things that are on your mind?
Yeah, I would just ask Carmen, when we think about asking people to make a new decision about something they're not familiar with, often we've talked about linking it or making it analogous to a previous decision that they've made. You know, it's a lot like this, and it sort of pings the brain to say, I made that decision before and it was safe and it was successful. Therefore, this one has the same characteristics. And I think of the difference there between analogous versus metaphorical, and the idea that the brain needs to be concrete to make a decision versus just abstract. The difference between metaphors and analogies, am I sniffing around the right science there?
Yeah, you definitely are. I'm thinking of some personal examples. Like, for instance, I was in Vegas, and I've been there many times. So Vegas is like the mecca of conferences, and as you know, you and I are presenting at quite a few events. And every time I go to Vegas, I have a tradition where I want to watch a show. Well, I've been there so many times that I've run out of shows to watch. And now I'm on like the B list for watching shows, or I'll just watch almost anything just to see what's going on. And there was this show that I watched recently that was called Absence. And I was asking people, well, what can you tell me about absence? Should I make the decision to go or not? And they said, well, it's like a Cirque du Soleil, except smaller and a bit more risque. So now that I have the Cirque du Soleil mental model in my mind, and I already know that that's a very concrete picture, I can more easily make that decision because now it's already part of my long-term memory. So I really like how you're prompting us to think in terms of decision making, and if you're giving the brain something that feels familiar, that could be such an important step instead of constantly trying to impress audiences with novelty all the time.
Yeah, it's a previous, safe, successful decision that you link it to, and all of a sudden your abstract new thing feels like a simpler, safer potential action to take. So I've often thought that often people abuse metaphors, and it makes things actually more abstract versus leading to an analogy that makes things more concrete and decidable.
Exactly, and notice what's happening to our brains right now. Like right now, I almost got chills as I'm looking at this picture, and I'm very grateful for the person who submitted this because they titled this picture "Longing," and it is such an emotional and touching picture. Thank you so much for submitting this to us. And notice what happens now that we have this balance of concrete and abstract, and also notice the strength of the emotion that comes through because of that balance. And when the emotion is that strong, by the way, there is a much stronger electrochemical signal that gets generated in our brain. And that's what contributes, by the way, to an increased likelihood of a memory trace. So thank you so much for submitting these. These are exactly the kinds of examples that I was looking for. If you're thinking about what enthusiasm means, well, there we go. I love the picture and its balance. And I wonder what this one could be called. It says it's an abstract concrete, and perhaps this is yeah, there you go, your notion of belief. And that too is such a concept that you can't fully touch. Perhaps sometimes you don't understand it, but you see a sweet picture like that, you're more likely to lean in. I wonder what we could title this one. Tim, as you're looking at this, what abstract concept could be associated with this? Obviously, there's a concreteness of it all because you actually have concrete.
Oh boy, that puts me on the spot. Do you have a good one, Carmen, while I ponder some more?
Well, I would say seeing the light at the end of the tunnel could be a good one, and perhaps hope as you're going through something that feels
around the corner, right? You know, the good news, the good stuff could be just around the corner or something like that.
Exactly, or perhaps the best is yet to come.
Yeah.
That could be as well. I love how sometimes if people take us literally with this assignment, like you can see some more concrete things in here. So that's a good one as well. But see, if you're thinking about the concept of happiness and you're simply showing some food, then that could work as well. But and here's that belief one again. I think we're seeing the pattern. And I'm wondering what this one could mean. There is your inspiration, perhaps, or there is that notion that we just mentioned about the best is yet to come. Overall, we're very grateful for your suggestions because when you have this skill of pairing up those abstracts and the concrete, you can definitely get the brain to not only pay attention for longer, but also remember what you want them to remember. And speaking of enabling people to remember what you want them to remember, one of the reasons why they forget is because of this notion called interference. And what do I mean by this? When you're giving the brain a message that is too much alike other messages, like you can see in here, it's very hard for people to truly remember what you said after 2 days. In here, we are doing a test with one company, and we are saying, if you're talking about predictive analytics, look at these messages and pick yours. And people have yet to pick their own message. It is that alike other people's messages. See, even in here, as you're looking to complete this blank spot, it's not vodka, by the way. It is one of these 3 companies that I'm listing here on the screen. but any one of them could be filling out that spot. See, when you're enabling people to remember something, they have the ability to create a gist kind of memory, so they kind of sort of remember, or a verbatim memory where they precisely remember what you said. Like, for instance, as you're looking at my screen here, do you know who said this quote? If you're using the questions box, I would love to get your answers on this one, because this is one of the those overly attributed quotes to Einstein. But a few of you I see here in the box that you're saying the same thing, but he never said that. How about this one? Do you guys know who may have said this? Or I should ask who this one is attributed to?
Yogi Berra.
Yes. And guess what? This is not him. And many of you may have seen this quote, and it is not attributed to her. Paul Revere, by the way, is associated often with the British are coming, but apparently he never said that. So I'm mentioning this because as you're reflecting on your content, be very cautious, because there is a difference between you saying something and people precisely remembering what you said. It's for that reason why we can generate some humor out of it all, because you can see the difference between the real version and the comedy version in this case. And when it comes to memory, just know that you're in control, coming back to that habit number one, of giving people enough so that they can build the memory, not just for the content, but for you, the source. And where do those details come from? Well, they come from what we were talking about earlier. So see, we come full circle to that habit number one of attracting attention, and in particular, so those physical properties of stimulation sometimes. But just make sure that you take it in your responsibility to associate you, the source, with the content itself, because otherwise, if people only get the gist and they forget that it was you who said it, then you might end up giving somebody else's presentation. We find some points of differentiation and source memory coming from emotion. This is the reason why we so enjoyed that picture that you sent, that was the belonging, because of the emotion of it all. And when it comes to emotion, we're very particular what we're studying. For instance, here we're studying intersection of quadrants, which we as scientists love. We're looking at arousal in terms of, is the brain engaged enough in experience? And we're looking at valence. Is it looking at the experience positively or negatively from the brain perspective? As you're picturing that circumflex, notice how we now can position it on top of a stimulus that we study with EEG. This dot that you see here in the upper left corner is the aggregated signal from 20 people's brains as they're watching this video. And we know that at some point there's reaching this boredom stage. This is the lower left quadrant where the brain is not engaged, but it's not really all that angry as it would here in the upper left corner. But the point is that now we're even using emotion as a source of understanding how the brain binds the content and you, the source. And we advocate that you have to do something differently these days to differentiate your signal, so to speak, your stimulus. And an intensified emotional approach could be your guideline as well. This is why we believe in Slide Club so much, because as you have some slides that may look a little bit more dim, you can prime them with something that looks a little bit more intense, like you're seeing in some of our slides here. That then gets the brain to pay extra attention, have extra engagement, quite often generates that extra emotion. Then it is because of that that you can earn about 30 seconds up to a minute more of attention after these slides. So what you put after these slides is definitely up to you, and that's where you're getting the biggest benefit, because we're helping prime the brain to pay attention and stay focused, and we can see how that is being measured with EEG. So that is habit number 4 here, and you can see how you can invite the brain to pay attention and indeed stay focused for a while. But at some point, you have to differentiate enough so that you're not ending up giving somebody else's presentation. You've been listening to us for quite some time, and we have a handout that we can send you. I will type in the email address that you can email so that we can send you a handout with all of these guidelines. So it's info@corporatevisions.com. memzy@carmen.com, and that email will have come to all of you. It's been a pleasure to share some of these principles, and I guarantee that as you're using them in any of your communications, you will increase the chances that the brain will move in your favor. Tim, thank you so much for inviting me, and Steve, thank you for organizing this, and I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thanks, Carmen. I appreciate it. We just have the couple minutes here. 4 habits of highly forgettable people, and then a couple ideas on how to break those habits. And I like at the end, you gave some hope where even if like you would insert one slide that deviates significantly from the norm, it creates attention and better memory of the very next thing they see. You've reopened that connection, and the very next slide that they see, they will engage more, and they will pay more attention, and they will remember more. So I think if people look at this and, wow, there's a lot I need to think about, even that small idea to create a bit of a deviating moment in your pattern to spike the brain's attention for the very next thing is like the first thing you can do this afternoon to improve that. So Carmen, thank you very much. Yes, info@corporatevisions.com, and that will get you these slides, PDF, and it'll get you the recording link. And we're also putting an infographic together on these 4 habits and the reminders of what to do about it, so that you can hang that up in your home office or cubicle or wherever you are, and always use that as a checklist when you consider what you need to do next to be more memorable and not be forgettable. So thank you, Carmen. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. Take care and have a good rest of the week.